Hi everyone, Dr. Hall here doing our last section on male reproductive abnormalities. So we're going to talk about infertility or subfertility, meaning not having as robust a fertility as we would otherwise expect. So otherwise known as a decreased sperm count, often is what it's called, but it might not be the count so much as a few other characteristics. So it turns out in order to be fertile, in order for your sperm to be able to successfully fertilize an egg and result in a zygote, which then might turn into a baby, there are three basic characteristics that your semen, the sperm in your semen need to kind of meet. One is you need to have enough of them. So one of the things that's kind of mind-boggling is that a normal ejaculate contains between 100 and 500 million sperm. Millions, right? So you need to have enough, right? So if you have a low sperm count, then the odds are in your favor, right? You don't have as many little swimmers that are hopefully getting to the egg. So you want to have a lot of them. So you need to have the normal quantity or normal number or sperm count. Also, you need to have normal morphology. So morphology is the word that means shape and size. So you want them to have a nice, aerodynamic head, a good mid-piece with those mitochondria, and a strong tail. You don't want to have little misshapen ones or ones with two heads or ones with two tails. These things all happen, right? So obviously, if you're making hundreds of millions per day, not all of them are going to be perfect, right? But you need to have a certain percentage of them that are well formed, right? That have normal shape and size. And then finally, they need to be good swimmers. So we call that motility, their ability to move. And so they need to be able to swim well and quickly and in a straight direction, right? Sometimes when you look at a semen sample, you'll see sperm just swimming in circles. And that's not going to really get them anywhere, right? So you need enough of them, they need to be well shaped, and they need to be good at swimming. So the most crude measurement, right, of the easiest to measure of all of these is just the overall count. And so there's actually been a lot of attention devoted to this, especially in the past couple of decades, because the average sperm count of people in at least Western countries, so the United States and Western Europe, has been declining significantly over the past several decades. So what we're seeing here is, in the left end of that chart is the late 80s, early 90s, and then up through 2005. This was from a particular French study looking at 35-year-old men, and the average sperm count decreased by 30%. That's really significant. So that's like, oh. So what could be causing this, right? Well, so we know that anything that elevates the temperature of the scrotum and therefore the testicles will impair the ability of the seminiferous tubules to make good sperm, right? So is it just everybody's wearing tighter pants or tighter underwear or using hot tubs more, or that we're using laptops, right, which keep that temperature, that heat source close to the scrotum? Or is it that we all sit around more, and when you're sitting, the thing that you're sitting on keeps heat in? So that's a thought, right? That perhaps that's part of what's causing this. Another possibility is it might be related to marijuana use, which has also been on the increase and significantly on the increase in certain parts of the United States since it was legalized, right? So even more in the past years than previously. It's tricky. So the problem is some of the studies of marijuana on sperm show that it decreases sperm quantity, in morphology, and motility. But there have also been some other studies in marijuana users that show that it seemed to improve their sperm. So the data is a little bit all over the place and kind of new, actually. And unfortunately, I was reading through some of the studies, and in one of the studies, they lumped in guys who smoked pot every single day were users. And even somebody who smoked once in the last 3 months was lumped in with those people. They were all considered users. They didn't differentiate. Now, if you think about it from a biological perspective, dose and frequency are important. So, smoking a joint once in the last 3 months, I think would have a very different physiological effect on your body from smoking several times a day, every day for the past 3 months. So some of the studies haven't been well done. Some of the data is contradictory. And so it turns out we just don't know. We know that some of the compounds in marijuana do seem to affect the testicles in a variety of ways. Stay tuned. We're still trying to figure out exactly what the story is here. So this may not be a sufficient explanation, right? So what else could there be that could be causing this significant drop in sperm count that we're seeing across the board in all men? It's possible that it could have to do with endocrine disruptors. So remember, xenoestrogens are chemicals in the environment. They're in plastics, they're in pesticides. They're not designed to act like estrogen, but just kind of as a side effect, they happen to act in the body like estrogen. So certainly giving estrogen to a male-bodied person would absolutely be expected to decrease their ability to make sperm. So GQ magazine did an article that I thought was pretty well done called Sperm Count Zero. And so they included this graphic here. So we're looking at two different things. So in the red, we are seeing the average mean total sperm count in millions. And so you can see that in 1970, it was at 338. And then in 2010, it was down to 138, which is less than half, right? Less than half as many sperm as we used to be seeing. So that's pretty alarming. Just 2 points on that graph, though. So I'd like to see them put some more studies in there because I think it might not be quite that clear cut. But then in the white, what you're seeing is it's kind of a crude measurement, but it's global plastics production. Right? And so you can't deny that over the same decades, when we're seeing a decrease in sperm count, we have had substantial increases in the amount of plastic that are in our lives. I happen to have been alive through almost all of the times represented on this graph, and I can tell you there was not a lot of plastic around when I was a kid. And now there is a ton of plastic around, especially, the food you eat, right, is so much of it is packaged in plastic. And we know some of that plastic material leaches into the food itself. We also know that we have so much plastic in our environment that it's now in our water. The compounds are in our water. We're drinking it. It's microplastics, right, are in rainwater now. So it's just it's ubiquitous. We're constantly exposed to it. And we know that some of the plastics can act as endocrine disruptors. So it's a really valid question. Is this what's causing the decline in sperm count? And if so, what are we going to do about it? Because that might end up kind of being a problem for the human race if we're no longer able to have children very successfully. So it's important, however, that just because it looks like there's a correlation between those two things, right, it doesn't necessarily mean that this caused that, right? It tells us, oh, we should look into this, right? But it doesn't prove anything. So one of my favorite things is Tyler Vigan, I don't know how they say their name, has this website of spurious correlations. So what we're seeing here in this chart is in the blue, the divorce rate in Maine, and then in red, the per person consumption of margarine, right? So you can see they go together like exactly. But do I really think that eating less margarine is causing less divorce in Maine? Well, that would be a pretty convoluted explanation, right? So just because things seem to have a relationship doesn't necessarily mean that they do have a relationship to each other. So the question becomes, how then can we know? And as scientific thinkers, right? So what do we do? So we see that there's this decline in sperm at the same time that there's this massive increase in plastic production. So how can we try to figure out if that's what's causing this, right? So the first hurdle that we have to kind of achieve is biologic plausibility, right? Is it plausible? Does it seem reasonable that plastics could interfere with sperm production. So we already touched on that, right? So we already know that yes, plastics can interfere with the endocrine system, with our hormonal system. And we know that our hormonal system is important for reproductive function, like spermatogenesis. So we kind of hit that biologic plausibility threshold pretty well. So that lends credence to this idea that we should take this seriously and investigate it further. So the kind of the next step would be to do some experimental animal studies, right? So maybe we take some mice or some rats, and a bunch of them we expose to a lot of plastics, and the bunch of them we don't. And we look at the difference in sperm count, right? So that would be really useful information for helping us to answer this question, is that causing this, right? Now, it wouldn't really be ethical to do that with humans, right? So we couldn't really say, okay, you 1,000 male-bodied people, we're now going to have you gnaw on plastic every day for the next 5 years, and we'll check your sperm count, right? So since we know there might potentially be some harm, like we're not going to do that. It's also a little tough because all of us are exposed to plastics, right? So it's tough. So we can't really do an experiment, but we can do case control studies, right? So case control means look at people who have normal sperm count and look at people who have low sperm count, and then look to see what's different between the two, right? So can we look at those two and see, does one of these groups have higher exposure to plastics than the other? Does one of these groups have higher maybe blood levels of certain compounds that are found in plastics than the other, right? So that would be a way to try to answer this question of whether this is really a causative relationship, right? So we've got that first hurdle down, and so experiments are now underway in animals to try to figure this out, and also looking at different populations of humans to see what's different in people with normal versus abnormal sperm count. So in summary, so talking about infertility and not talking about kind of one individual, but we're kind of talking about more a population level phenomenon that we're seeing where we're having this significant decline in sperm count in male-bodied people in Western nations in recent years. I don't know what's happening in other parts of the world, so that's why I'm qualifying that. Perhaps we're all just using hot tubs or laptops more, maybe. I don't know. Are we more sedentary? Yes and no. So it's really hard to say. Again, the marijuana question is kind of still unsettled, but perhaps it's the xenoestrogens. Perhaps it's the endocrine disruptors that are ubiquitous now in our environment. So that's it for male abnormalities. And then next time we'll start talking about female anatomy.